Our format is simple. The moderator and then each of the panelists will make brief introductory statements. The moderator will lead a conversation among the group, and then questions will be invited from the audience. We'll end each panel at exactly the appointed time, and I beg the indulgence of everyone for any draconian measures I take in that regard, but we do have a schedule to keep. And one more thing, books by all of our panelists are available for sale by the BC Bookshop right outside the theater. If you go outside and make a right down the hallway, you can buy the books, and then if you buttonhole the panelists as you see them coming out the door, I'm sure they'll be happy to sign them for you. Our first panel is called Civil Rights and Voting Rights, the History. Panelist Taylor Branch, first gentleman on the left, has just completed the third volume of his epic biography of Martin Luther King, the first volume of which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1988. His roots are in North Carolina, and he comes to us from Baltimore. I have never forgotten one remark of Taylor's from years ago. American history progresses when you have prophetic voices like King's in tune with the sensibilities of women. Alex Kesar, at the far end, from our own Cambridge, Massachusetts, is a professor of history and social policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He is the author of The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, which won a raft of prizes, including the prestigious Eugene Genovese Prize. There's a terrific interview with Alex on the subject of voting rights in the latest issue of the Mass Humanities newsletter. Harris Wofford, in the middle, had a career in public activism and public service that would have been historic even if he had not also been a senator from Pennsylvania. Martin Luther King called him the only lawyer who would help him go to jail rather than help him stay out of jail. He headed up the civil rights section of John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. He is currently working on a book about a lifetime of his experiences, and it should be quite a book. Our moderator, Jim Fallows, has been a national correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly for more than 2 decades. He has covered everything from American politics to foreign affairs and has seen politics in the White House firsthand as the head speechwriter for Jimmy Carter. So a reminder, this panel will conclude at 2 p.m. sharp. Jim, over to you. Thank you.
You will have noticed the freighted look with which Cullen emphasized 2 p.m. sharp when looking at me. That's partly because I was in arrears in arriving here today. I'm sorry for that. And for the last 20 years, Cullen, as my editor, has become accustomed to nagging me for stories that were weeks overdue. So that's the context. I'll try to have the panel move more briskly than I have moved in getting here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. We all know that history is not valuable purely in its instrumental sense for the lessons, quote unquote, that it sheds on the present day. But as a comment introducing the first panel of several today, I thought it was worth emphasizing some of the resonance of the themes we're going to be discussing in this next session with themes of public concern at the moment. There are times in American history where the machinery of democracy and the workings of that machinery is of particular interest because the machine does not seem to be connecting in the way that would be ideal. I think we recognize we are entering such a moment now, 40 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. At the state level, there are intense questions about the fairness and flexibility of districting among the parties, among races, among other interest groups. At the congressional level, we know the House of Representatives. There is intense question about how representative the House is any longer when so few districts are up for contest. At the senatorial level, we seem to be entering another of the Gilded Ages when only people with the personal assets to buy a seat have a fighting chance at a seat. And of course, at the presidential level, we've had 2 successive elections where the actual machinery of government seems to have been as much in question as the issues of the candidates were putting forward. About 1 month ago, former President Jimmy Carter, my one-time employer, and former Secretary of State James Baker, who knows about voting machinery firsthand from the Florida recount in 2000, issued a very significant report calling for a sweeping new look at how voting works in the United States. They were looking at the role of money, both in advertising and giving people a chance to be heard and represented, about the very precinct-level machinery of how people were able to register and vote, about the more literal form of machinery, the computerized nature of voting, about the larger senses of trust and participation and transparency and equality that our electoral system is supposed to both embody and enable if we are to be a functioning democracy indeed. I mention all this because we're about to discuss for the next few hours arguably the last major time the United States went through such an exercise of examining very carefully the machinery of democracy and seeing how it could more fairly represent the values of the nation, the composition of the nation, and the goals to which we all aspire. And so that, to me, while appreciating the history of the Voting Rights Act in its own right, especially with three people who have studied it in complementary and intensified ways, it also is, I will be listening with split consciousness for what implications, what connections, what resonances we have also to the politics of the early 21st century. I'm going to introduce each of the three panelists just with no setup other than to ask them for their opening observations, and I'll say a word about each of them before turning to him. I'm going to like to start with Taylor Branch. Taylor and I have a connection that Cullen might not even be aware of. Long ago, Taylor was one of the first employees of a magazine called The Washington Monthly, which has been a wonderful small magazine. And when Taylor left, for a reason I'll name in a moment, Charlie Peters, who was the editor, plugged me into that hole, and I spent the next 2 years being reminded of the inadequacies that I had compared to Taylor in trying to do the work of the magazine. Whenever I would call Taylor for solace and guidance and consolation, I tried to reach him in Texas, where he, with another young man, was trying to organize the McGovern campaign in Texas. That young man was Bill Clinton, with whom I shot the breeze sometimes, but I'm even happier to hear from Taylor Branch right now than I would be from President Clinton. Taylor Branch.
Thank you, Jim. I'm happy to be here with you. I'm a little bit bursting at the seams on this subject because I have just finished 24 years immersed in writing about this with the third volume whose galley proofs are back at the hotel, and it'll be out in January, and it starts on Selma Bridge and is all about the right to vote. And if the theme of my 3 volumes, they're all about race, democracy, and religion, but roughly speaking, the earlier period was more about race and the middle period about religion, and this one is more about democracy and how those 3 elements interact. What democracy really means. What is the vote? It was a naked encounter with democracy and the responsibilities of a citizen, and is still, to me, resonant with wonders that the people who had been denied the very basics of democracy were leaders in the political history of democracy that is still spilling forth. I firmly believe that we live in an era that is still being reformed by Martin Luther King and that movement to this very day. It is why we are where we are on gay rights, women's rights, a number of other rights. Once people start struggling over what the essence of the right to vote really is and what the essence of equal citizenship is, it has profound effects. So we are in an era now where I think you hear the spirit of Martin Luther King in the language, but our politicians govern like Caesar. They talk like Martin Luther King and govern like Caesar, so you have this dissonance in our politics, but I think, as Jim rightly says, we are at another era, another time where we're really struggling over the fundamentals of democracy. I think we're doing it rather unconsciously, which is why the civil rights era would be a great model, because they did it very consciously. We've just gone through a period in Iraq where we had the first election, the first constitution, and subliminally, everybody across the board, right, left, center, somehow knew that it mattered whether or not Iraqi women, old people, and young people could get to the polls to vote. But nobody that I saw ever asked why that should matter to some grizzled warrior with a belt full of rocket grenades. But we do believe that. We believe the vote will win if it's established. So the question is, what is a vote? What is a vote? And I argue in my book essentially that every ballot is a piece of nonviolence. It is a piece of consent, hard won, to let the essence of every citizen decide great political questions. The heart and soul of democracy is nonviolence, represented in what the vote is. That's almost never discussed. Nonviolence was the most powerful concept to come out of the civil rights era and the first one to become passé. You've hardly ever heard it discussed in the last 30 or 40 years. But it is powerful. It goes to the essence, even the definition of what democracy is. All the rest of it is architecture, and vital architecture it is. But it only matters, you can only really look at the architecture very closely if you're in tune with what the essence of what you're talking about is, which is equal citizenship embodied in the vote, and the vote has to do with consensus and nonviolence in political affairs. It is a remarkable compact among the citizens. All political theory until we reconstituted Greek democracy 200 years ago was basically vertical. It was about the relationship of liege lords and who owed duty to what. And all political theory was vertical, all the way from God down to worms. The American Revolution changed all that. Our politics became horizontal. What we can make, what binds citizens of Massachusetts with citizens of Georgia, what binds the separate branches of government. And the vote is the particle essence underneath all of that. It's a piece of nonviolence, and it really matters who has the vote. The remarkable thing about these people down in Selma 40 years ago was that they took it upon themselves to win the right to vote even though they didn't have it. They answered the most fundamental paradox in how do you gain the vote without power if power is measured by the vote. And they entered that question. They took it upon themselves to do it. They didn't petition. They went out and marched. They had a plan in Selma to do this. Now, the Selma plan was a result of the Birmingham church bombing. The Birmingham church bombing had occurred 14 months before Selma started, and Jim Bevel and Diane Nash, who were two of the people on King's staff who had pushed him to let small children march in Birmingham, 6- and 8-year-olds, even mostly girls, felt so badly about the Birmingham church bombing that they resolved by morning to have one of two plans to present, either a Malcolm X vigilante plan to find and assassinate the Klansmen who put that bomb and killed the 4 little girls, or, because everybody knew who did it, and everybody knew that they could find people who were brass enough to exact vigilante justice, or something out of what they knew and had been applying nonviolence on a sufficient scale to answer the heinousness of that crime. And by the next morning, they had compiled a nonviolent plan to shut down Alabama nonviolently until it granted black people the right to vote, on the theory that if black people had the right to vote, elected officials wouldn't slough off crimes like this. Because as you know, the Birmingham church bombing was sloughed off. The first conviction was not until 1977, and the most recent one was just last year. And they went and they nagged Dr. King to have what became the Selma campaign. And I will end on the brink of the Selma campaign because it's a huge subject, and we have somebody who marched in Selma sitting right next to me. But I'd like to end with the significance of that march as it connects to people here in Boston. Dr. King went from the Nobel Peace Prize acceptance ceremony at the end of 1964 straight to Selma jail in January 1965. Everybody on his staff would have liked to have waited about 10 years and gone to chicken dinners celebrating the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Nobel Peace Prize, which changed the world. He willed himself back to Selma. It was a very critical moment for him as a leader to do that. He didn't have to do it, but he said he had promised these 2 kids on his staff that he would do the right to vote and their plan once segregation was ended with this with the law of 1964. When he went to Selma, he was there for 2 months demonstrating. Children went to jail again, and it didn't really generate that much response across the country, just as had happened in Birmingham. It required a breakthrough event. And of course, the breakthrough event was Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. Striking to me because it's within hours of the time that that march was attacked that the first Marine Combat Unit landed in Vietnam, the same day. So these two parallel events for advancing and securing democracy by nonviolence and by violence are occurring on a vast scale at almost the same time. But the significant thing that connects to Boston is that when this march, led by John Lewis, was repulsed on the bridge and charged with horses, gas masks, truncheons, and pushed people back across the Pettus Bridge, it was on TV that night. There are a lot of peculiar circumstances for why they showed it. They broke into Judgment in Nuremberg, which was shown for the first time on network television. And ABC felt that they needed to do that because they had had the sheriff in Selma, Jim Clark, on Issues and Answers that morning, fulminating in a racist way, and there have been a lot of protests saying they owed equal time, and they felt the way to give equal time was by showing these extraordinary pictures that had just come in the old technology. They had to fly up to New York with undeveloped film of what had occurred in the late afternoon on this march. They get to New York, and the executives who were feeling stung by their lawyers by having Jim Clark on that morning push this film right on to interrupt Judgment at Nuremberg, where millions of Americans are watching what it means to be a little citizen in the middle of the Holocaust. And Germans talking to Spencer Tracy, and then all of a sudden we interrupt this program to show you news today from Selma. King put out a call that night for people to come to Selma. And within 24 hours, people mobilized from all over the United States to go there, and they marched again the second try on Tuesday. This is the beginning of a huge political epic. The final march didn't take off for 2 more weeks of upheaval after a speech by Lyndon Johnson and a number of other things. But people in Boston were on the plane the next day. This was not something where they thought about it for a week, but they were on the plane the next day. Jim Reeb was on the plane along with Henry Hampton, also who made Eyes on the Prize 20 years later, and they slept in the airport that night. Seminarians from Episcopal Seminary slept in Dr. King's SCLC office that night because they couldn't get to Selma. A lot of them, they just went. The extraordinary thing about it is that something touched people, that this was about something so fundamental that they would give up their ordinary lives and risk their lives that quickly. And that, to me, is the beginning of the extraordinary involvement of all citizens in Selma and the struggle over what it means to be an American citizen over the right to vote.
Thank you, Taylor. I lack a microphone, so I'll just project momentarily. Thank you for setting this up and also indirectly whetting everyone's appetite for the next volume of your book. Let's continue in chronological fashion with Harris Wofford, who, again, as Cullen was saying, there are so many elements in his public career and public service, it's impossible to isolate any of them as being most important, but certainly among the most important was in Selma. So please tell us, continue the story.
And being beaten by Rick Santorum. Everyone's more interested in the failures than in successes. But I was once asked in a political race how lucky you were, this reporter said, to have worked and been with Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and John Kennedy. And I said, some luck. All 3 of the public men that meant the most to me were killed. And I tracked her down afterwards to say, please don't print that. Of course, I was tremendously lucky. We were all lucky that those 3 were together. And just as we don't know what would have happened after the Union was saved and slavery was ended in the Civil War, Lincoln had not been assassinated, what the different kind of reconstruction it would be. But we were lucky he was there, and we were lucky that that pivotal point in American history occurred. 90 years after the shot heard round the world, the civil rights amendments and the right to vote was secured by the Constitution. And then it took 100 years from 1865 to 1965. And I was indeed lucky to be at that pivotal moment, in not the John Lewis courageous moment, Bloody Sunday, but on the planes going down right after the King's call, and sleeping on a floor in a motel with 9 Episcopalian ministers who let me into the room when I got there in the middle of the night. And to be on the march, and then the 300 people picked for the 3 days for the single-lane highway and the sleeping in the mud. After all, the young people who were in the forefront were picked to be in the 300, and then 22 organizations had their leaders picked. And then they had 10 special guests of Dr. King, and Andy Young finally came out of the tent and read my name, and I was privileged to be in the mud and to be on that amazing march. By the time of the march occurred, Lyndon Johnson had gone to Congress and had called for the most sweeping Voting Rights Act in our history, which we're here celebrating today, and had ended by saying, "We shall overcome." And he had federal helicopters flying overhead. He had federalized marshals along the way of the march, until some of us complained that they were looking at the marchers instead of out in the bushes. And the word got signaled, and they turned around and faced the bushes in the woods instead of looking at us. And Lyndon Johnson arranged portable toilets along the way because he didn't want us messing up along the way. And then we, by then, joined with all kinds of great people from around the country for the final thousands and thousands marching to the steps of the Confederacy. Wallace was said to be looking out the windows of his office from the top of the hill. And that was when Martin Luther King, when Andy Young said, we're winning a revolution today without a shot being fired. And then King said, "How long, O Lord?" And for the first time he said, "I can say, not long." How long? Not long. It was a great litany and a great moment. And we'll never know what would have happened if after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and the other great goal of the civil rights movement of that climactic decade and of 100 years struggle of the NAACP and lawyers and brave people in the front lines with ups and downs, great cycles of hope and despair. What would have happened if Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy had not been killed, John Kennedy, in the 40 years since that march? And if I were to just push us back and not to speak until I get another chance to speak about the Gandhi element of this, the other pivotal point was when Rosa Parks, 50 years ago, December 1st, sitting on the bus in the midsection of where you were supposed to get up if you were black and move if a white person came on, did not get up, did not move, showed that the way to stand up for your rights was to sit down, as sit-in students had done before that, and then said, "Then arrest me. You may arrest me." And pivotal to Martin Luther King had to have been something like Rosa Parks doing that. E.D. Nixon, Gandhi with Gun, that I'd done a paper on when I was at Howard Law School in 1951 on the Railway Labor Act integration. He was taking a shotgun down to the polls in registration offices in Montgomery to escort Negroes to try to vote. And they had Rosa Parks, I reread her autobiography yesterday. She said she, about that time, had a scroll with 31 names of Negroes, including herself, who had finally gotten registered. And she went to Highlander Folk School the summer before that moment came in the bus. She went to Highlander Folk School because a white woman, Virginia Durr, a great person of the civil rights movement in Montgomery, a brave one, had encouraged her and given her a scholarship and paid her way to go to this workshop on desegregation, where there was a fairly intense indoctrination in nonviolence in Gandhi, because in 1951, a Gandhi leader that I had persuaded to come to this country and deliver some of the Gandhian doctrine of spade, prison, and vote. It isn't just civil disobedience and the vote. They also, the Gandhi formula is the other side of the coin of civil disobedience is constructive service, of creating the institutions of justice. And democracy, Gandhi said, and King loved this part of it, was three-dimensional in terms of the citizen and how you achieve self-government. It was indeed the vote, but it was also being prepared to say no to injustice, even to the point of going to jail, protest. And it was also being a social inventor, of being somebody who, in daily work, the daily drudgery, created the institutions of justice. And she put in her head, she says, the idea that someday she might do something like that. She hadn't planned it, that bus trip at all. She was tired. It wasn't that she was tired because she was older. She was 42. She wasn't tired because that was a particularly tiring day. She was tired of taking it. And she said no. She thought someday she might have done it. And if E.D. Nixon had not then joined their political women's caucus council that he and Rosa Parks had helped organize to call a bus boycott, and then say, I've got to get the ministers in, because the only way I can get the mass of the Negroes of Montgomery is to get the people that speak to them in the congregations, and called a dozen or more ministers together, and they together decided to ask this young new preacher to be head of the Montgomery bus boycott. One day they thought they had in mind. Became 365 or whatever days it was. But this might be an encouraging point, both to stop, but to thank the Foundation for the Humanities, to believe that sometimes workshops, panels, symposiums, talks can make a difference. And think what a difference not only Martin Luther King's silver tongue and his vision and his courage meant, but Rosa Parks being at that workshop, putting the idea in her head, and then doing it.
Thank you very much. I do now possess a microphone. So we've heard from a journalist scholar, or scholarly author, if you will, and we've heard from a statesman scholar, and now we're going to hear from a scholar. And it would be good if Alex Kesar could put into scholarly and historic context what we've been discussing.
Well, what I had prepared to do, with long preparation as we discussed this in one phone conversation, was to try to set the historical stage for the Voting Rights Act, to sort of go over in 7 minutes to do a deft job of dealing with 200 years of history. That was my assignment.
You're up to it.
And then also picking up on your introductory comments, Jim, to now bring it up to thinking about the present. And I've picked 2 moments that I want to sort of mention and talk about. The first, not surprisingly, the writing of the U.S. Constitution, which I think we should think of as the moment of the original sin of voting rights in the United States. And the reason I say that is that there is no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. There wasn't in 1789, there wasn't in 1850, there is not now. There is a right to vote in the Iraqi Constitution. And in the Constitution of most other civilized nations, but there is no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. And if you have any doubts about that, the Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore affirmed it loud and clear. And it states it very clearly about presidential elections. But the Founding Fathers, magnificent as many of them at least were not even sure that voting was a right rather than a privilege. They did not enshrine it in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. And for practical political reasons of the 1780s and early 1790s, they decided to leave the right to vote to the states. I mean, this is part of the setting for what would happen 170 years later. They left it to the states, and the states imposed all sorts of requirements, one of which, and I'm sure most of you know this, was property requirements, that you had to own some kind of property. Now, there were people who objected to that, one of whom, and I'm going to bore you with a one-paragraph quotation, one of the objectors, and he was pretty unusual, was Benjamin Franklin, who told a story about property requirements that he told again and again, and it was one of the most widely known political stories 50 years later, even in the United States. And this is the story. This is the way he used to tell it. Because the exact property requirements varied by state and what counted as property, but in fact, farm animals sometimes counted as the property that you could use to vote. This is a quote from Franklin telling the story. Today, a man owns a jackass worth $50, and he is entitled to vote. But before the next election, the jackass dies. The man, in the meantime, has become more experienced, his knowledge of the principles of government and his acquaintance with mankind are more extensive, and he is therefore better qualified to make a proper selection of rulers. But the jackass is dead, and the man cannot vote. Now, gentlemen, pray inform me, in whom is the right of suffrage, in the man or in the jackass? Property requirements were gradually, but not completely abolished early in the 19th century. Now I want to take us to a second moment that I want to talk about, which is the aftermath of the Civil War. As we all know, in the aftermath of the Civil War, a number of constitutional amendments are passed, one of which is the 15th Amendment, which in a certain sense guarantees the right to vote to African Americans. Although I say in a certain sense very carefully, because it doesn't say black people can vote. It's phrased as a negative prohibition. It says you can't deny people the right to vote because of their race, color, and previous condition of servitude. There's still no affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. But the belief was that this would actually help a lot. And for a while in the South, this did help a lot. I mean, again, part of the background to this is that in the late 1860s and into the 1870s and even into the early 1880s, depending on the state, African Americans did vote, and they elected representatives to Congress and to the Senate, and hundreds, even thousands of local officials. And then what happens, gradually, again, the story varies state by state, is that white supremacist governments came back to power in various states, and they began taking a lot of different steps to keep African Americans from voting, ranging from gerrymandering to sort of new requirements. This is before they got to really the full-scale legal assault, to far less subtle techniques of intimidation, burning down people's houses, and outright murder. And that became in parts of the South very widespread in the 1880s. And there were some political factions in the North, based actually in the Republican Party. This was back in the really olden times when the Republican Party was in favor of voting rights. But the people in the Republican Party wanted the federal troops to go back, wanted to do something to go back and intervene in the South. They were losing political strength in the South. This is all after the Union armies had been pulled out after 1877. And they designed a piece of legislation that they hoped would enforce voting rights in the South. It was known as the Federal Elections Bill of 1890, and colloquially it was known as the Lodge Force Bill, named after Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, since everything is connected. And in fact, that bill was an early version of the Voting Rights Act. It provided to send federal supervisors in to deal with Southern elections. It would have put the results of Southern elections under the control of the federal courts. It was a way of the federal government going into the South to prevent the rampant racial discrimination that was occurring in elections in the 1880s and into the 1890s. The federal elections bill, Republicans waited until a moment when they had a Republican president and controlled both houses of Congress. The president was for it. The House of Representatives passed it, and it went to the Senate, where it was met by a filibuster a couple of Republicans split off, and the Federal Elections Bill of 1890 and then into 1891 was lost on a procedural vote of 35 to 34. One vote prevented that bill from sort of staying alive and likely being passed and signed by President Harrison. There is a lesson there about seizing the moment when you have a chance for reform. And at that point, the federal government retreated, and it was not for another 75 years that it became possible to seriously present legislation like the Voting Rights Act. That's a long time. Final thing I want to say is not only so seizing the moment, and the moment doesn't recur, all the time, is that one small and little noticed feature of the Voting Rights Act was a detail in it that instructed Congress and the Justice Department to commence a lawsuit to test state poll taxes, to see whether state poll taxes would be considered, were still considered constitutional. Because in fact, in the 1960s, economic and financial and pecuniary requirements to vote were in fact still legal. And it was a test case called Harper versus Virginia that comes out of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that leads to the United States government, the Supreme Court, finally declaring, in the words of Justice Douglas, that wealth is not germane to the right to vote. And so, any property or economic or financial requirements for voting finally become unconstitutional in the United States in 1966. So in fact, it's thanks to the Voting Rights Act, although we don't normally think of it in these terms, but it's thanks to the Voting Rights Act as well that there is no longer, at least most of the time, there's a recent law in Georgia which raises the question again, but there's no longer sort of most of the time any uncertainty about who's supposed to have the right, the man or the jackass. Thank you.
We've had 3 superb introductory and framing comments, and before going on to a discussion, let me make a couple of housekeeping announcements. Should there be anyone in the room whose cell phone is not yet silenced, please do it at this point. Consistent with Colin's emphasis on moving things along on time, we will have time for questions from all of you in a little while. First, I'd like to try to work down a couple of the very long list of questions I've come up with while listening to these fascinating presentations. And the first one I have, this is for any or all of you, whoever feels motivated to answer. As we look back 40 years later, what is evident now about that struggle that was not evident or was misunderstood at the time? Either people who were heroes, who were underappreciated, who were obstacles, who were not fully noticed, turning points that weren't recognized at the time, or things that in retrospect we see were largely chance. What do we know now that people didn't know at the time, and how does that affect our understanding of the episode?
Everything I know now, I didn't know then. So I'll bow out.
Actually, Alice Harris Wofford, as a participant 40 years ago and as a scholar-statesman now, what looks different? What do you appreciate in a different way?
Well, I think I obviously, on the edge of my 80th year, know far more about the cycles of hope that have been the pattern of American history and of the civil rights story that Alex was just describing. And being congenitally hopeful, I read that as an affirmative story in that the great things in American history happen because of the gap between the ideal and the reality. When the gap got too great on slavery and other things, and it broke down in an explosion of the Civil War, it would be very hard to say that is a good story. And yet, if you look at the whole of American history, including the civil rights story, it is the time people come alive, and some people give their lives, and things change, comes for us as it did to people in the Soviet Empire. The moment when the great things happen. And I think it's very important that this kind of an occasion occur and that books like your books, both left and right here, are written. Is the history, it isn't so much that I'm preaching what I've learned now that I didn't know then. I'm also aware now of how many people that I meet, of the younger generations that include most people here, but the much younger generations know so little about it. And when the revisionists take hold, the story of the civil rights struggle to achieve under King, first the right to vote, his first great, the group out of which the boycott came, had been focused on registering Negroes to vote. And they were very wary of taking on desegregation. But with King, both were taken on. And his first foray into the North on a major scale was before the Washington Monument, I believe, in '57, paraphrasing Churchill, "Give me the vote, give us the vote, and we can finish the job." Churchill said, "Give us the arms." And the vote was, they were the arms that they wanted to get. But those two things, the vote was won. We have major problems of districting and other things, but the vote was won by Black Americans and with Black Americans. And publicly enforced segregation was ended. It's what in the 40 years since we've not done that highlights what a gap there is between the mountains King pointed to in his last sermon that we still had to climb, that he might not see the promise, get to the promised land. We haven't climbed them very well. But it's the cycles of hope sense that I would not rest on, but be ready to be stirred by.
Do you want to volunteer on this point?
A quick supplement, I think, in listening to Harris, confirms this. What strikes me looking back is what a rare moment it was, a rare moment of a convergence of a lot of different circumstances, political, leadership, foreign policy. The pressures of the Cold War were not unimportant to what happened, and it was a time of prosperity. I mean, it's, a pessimistic thought that I occasionally have, and I try to banish them as well, is that if the Voting Rights Act had not been passed in the mid-1960s, could it have been passed any time in the last 20 years? I wonder.
But it was a meeting of public power and popular protest.
Right.
And if that meeting hadn't occurred, the protests could have been enormous. They could have been dramatic. All of the things could have occurred, but it would have been one hand clapping. If Eisenhower had been silent on Brown versus Board, said he didn't tell his wife what he thought about it. He had to send troops in. But if John and Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and the Congress of the United States, and before them the courts, had not met the protest movement, we wouldn't have ended public segregation and we wouldn't have won the right to vote.
Let me just extend that point a moment if I could. In writings about Gandhi, it's often said that he was fortunate, apart from his own genius and the historical circumstances, to be protesting against the British and not against Stalin and not against Hitler, because the British had a conscience he could appeal to. There was some sort of public sense of the standards they should be adhering to. And as we look back on the history of the 1960s, there was some sort of public conscience that could be addressed, whether it was in the person of Lyndon Johnson, who felt tormented about these things, or whether, again, the genius of the leaders of the movement. As we look back on that era and contemplate our own, what do we think that was a sort of illusory, that was a evanescent moment of conscience, or of addressable conscience in the 1960s, or how might such an address to conscience be recreated?
I would just say that I think the conscience is always there. You need to bring it to the surface. And what helped in the 60s, of course, is that you were only 20 years after World War II, which was fought against, a racist regime and a fascist regime. And you were 10 years after the Brown decision, in which you have the court saying that segregation is not compatible with fundamental American democratic practice. And so that frisson grew, and the movement played on it consciously to try to bring it. That's what the Freedom Rides and all these You know, Dr. King tried to preach America out of segregation in the late 50s, and it didn't work. And it was students who taught him that you have, against certain entrenched things, to lift conscience to the surface, you have to have sacrifice to amplify the voice of reason. And the sit-ins and that sort of thing still kept bringing to the surface the conscience that's always buried there in, you know, in all men are created equal, or even we the people, you know, in our public, both political and spiritual conscience. And King was, I think, one of the most distinctive things about King and his oratory is that he was very gifted at putting one foot in the patriotic documents and the other in the scriptural document to give people two roads of access to their conscience, you know, and his oratory was remarkably balanced that way. And of course, that balance itself harmonizes with the fundamental democratic idea of self-governing, you know, that we can govern ourselves. That in itself is an example. So you're pulling the conscious to the surface, and that was part of what the movement, that was really the essence of what the movement was about.
When Kennedy, John Kennedy made his great speech in June of 1963, when he finally said what King had dreamed of him saying, and we heard a few days ago from Ted Sorensen about King having said that when he heard that speech, he jumped up and said, "My God, that white man has hit a home run." But the other side of that is Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, and another kind of great leader of skill, political skill. When I went to recruit his support for John Kennedy in 1960, early 1960 or late 59, he said to me, he said, "Well, don't worry, I'll be having to vote for him because my wife's a Catholic and she loves him, and I couldn't sleep with her if I was not going to vote for him. But if you want to know who I believe has fire in his guts on this, and who, if he were elected president, and I can't support him because my constituency wouldn't understand it, but who I think would do more to really get at this problem, it's Lyndon Johnson. Because somewhere out of the crucible of Southern politics and Southern reality, he saw how race and racial discrimination was tearing the South apart and was a cancer on politics in the South, and he really saw it. Whereas you might say that John and Robert Kennedy were a little slow in some respects to learn, though their learning curve was extraordinary. By the time Robert Kennedy was killed, he was alongside Martin Luther King in his commitment passionately to ending racial discrimination and ending the war in Vietnam and winning a war on poverty. But I think it may be Boston a little bit. The discrimination that they thought they knew a lot about was against Irish Catholics and the immigrants, which they had overcome by working hard and by luck and other things. And I think there was a little residual sense that, you know, that's what discrimination is, and less of an understanding of this cancer of race on the American soul.
Senator Wofford mentioned that, you know, despite all the imperfections in the last 40 years, after all, the vote was won, and everything else might be details. How do you think the people who led the fight for the vote would have viewed the result that 40 years later, the bulk of black representation in the Congress in particular is sort of essentially gerrymandered single-race districts? How would they have viewed that, and what would they have wanted to do about it?
Well, it's better than having no vote. I don't think that there's been a whole lot of really good, that's what I think, public discourse on really fundamental matters that we had back then doesn't exist. And if we had more fundamental the one resolution that Arnold Schwarzenegger has on the ballot out in California, we tend to think of him as, you know, Terminator 3 or whatever joke, but I mean, he wants to try to address the whole issue of gerrymandering. And as a theoretical proposition, you could say that the more votes, the more districts, you could almost by computer set districts to maximize swing districts, and that would sensitize democracy. We don't have that kind of discussion going on right now, and as a result, you have my kids coming to me telling me that Jon Stewart has captured politics for them by coming in and saying that you have a better chance of losing your seat on the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba than of losing a House seat in the U.S. House, because we've got a 98-point-something% return rate, and that's not a very healthy democracy.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think that people in the 60s were envisioning this, this set of problems. And one thing we also have to remember is that the involvement of the courts in districting at all was quite new in the 60s. But, and certainly we have not had the political dialogue and political conversation about what representation should mean and how people should be represented. But I actually agree with Taylor, better single-member districts than the opposite. And one thing to note, joining a couple of different comments, is that, and it says something about the state of the current dialogue, there is now a right to vote amendment to the federal Constitution that's been introduced into Congress. And it's been introduced for each of the last 3 years by Representative Jesse Jackson Jr. And I actually was involved in the early stages, and I'm still very involved in trying to promote this, but in drafting it. And I remember after election 2000, I thought, aha, we need a right to vote amendment, in the Constitution. Who's going to oppose a right to vote in the U.S. Constitution? I was very young and naive in 2001. I was in my 20s in 2001, if you could believe that. But there's lots of opposition, but one of the notable things, I think this fact is precisely accurate, every member of the Congressional Black Caucus is a co-sponsor of the Right to Vote Amendment. That's important.
I'm going to invite your question, sorry.
Well, just, if you ask Martin Luther King what would disappoint him in what we've done since, I think you have to assume that he would start with where he was, which was the Poor People's March and winning a war against poverty, which we've been losing in so many respects in these years, and that the vote would be used to see that a president was elected that would apply the resources there, and linked to it, in his case, was ending the war in Vietnam so that the resources wouldn't be taken away. And Lyndon Johnson, who dreamed of his mistress being the war on poverty and the Great Society, but said to Sergeant Shriver, I can't give you your money anymore for it until I get this beast of a war, or more vulgar views, out of my way, which I'll do in a year, and then you'll have the money. And so Johnson and King would want to know what we're doing with the vote, however the machinery may be difficult to grind, but who we're electing president and otherwise to not take us into initiated war in Iraq and to really turn to efforts against poverty, unless he had a new epiphany to take him in some other direction. They were certainly the two great directions that he was pointing to.
I'm going to invite your questions in just a moment. I have one other question I'd like to ask the panel, and then I have some more that I'll save if there are no questions from the crowd. But please gravitate towards the microphones, if you would, while I ask this last question. As we all look back on the events of the 1960s, personalities had a huge effect. All of the effect and brilliance of Martin Luther King, the particular historical situation of LBJ, as we've said. As we look at racial politics in America, the role of Southern white Democrats has loomed large. LBJ, Bill Clinton, this is the position John Edwards is trying to put himself in. If for the foreseeable future, most white politicians from the South are going to be Republicans, what does that mean about the dynamic? Is there hope for white Republicans having any kind of this role that in different ways Johnson, Clinton, John Edwards have played? Or is the South going to be sort of out of there?
Where there's life, there's hope.
That would be a big break within the Republican Party. I mean, it's quite a, it's sudden in history that you have the Southern Republican Party spring up out of nowhere. As I grew up in Atlanta, and we didn't have any Republicans when I was a kid. It sprang up out of Barry Goldwater's vote against the Civil Rights Act of '64 in June of 1964, and candidates materialized out of the woodwork. If you look at the congressional directory in 1965, the first 5 Republican congressmen were elected from Alabama, and their bios have the word, they just have party, district chairman, party, that the word Democrat was stripped out because they couldn't put that in as a credential, but they were all Democrats who, so the Republican Party sprang up that way, and then it became not only the leadership of the South, but the leadership of the National Democratic Party is drawn largely from new Southern Republicans out of this whole new vocabulary that was created essentially that when segregation was no longer respectable, resistance to the federal government was. And government is bad, which became the dominant central idea in our politics in the last 40 years. For a Southern Republican now to repudiate that and essentially appeal for coalition votes would be a historic event. If you could get a Southern Republican governor to run for president and really appeal and be convincing on an equality or coalition platform, it would be amazing. What you have now is you have Southern Democrats struggling to run coalition campaigns, and that's new in the South. The Southern Republicans have essentially taken over the role of the old Democrats, segregationist Democrats, of a presumptively white party. And that's all the coded messages are behind that. And until you break out of that among the Republicans, you're going to have a kind of a stunted bipartisan competition in the South.
Any other comment on this point?
McCain, look at him, he's not Southern, and he lost the South Carolina primary. But Lindsey Graham, who was his leader in South Carolina, and such, you could add up and say, I think if that was a rerun, or McCain were teamed up with a Southern Republican, that they could do a lot to. I'm not campaigning for him. I'm a Democrat, but I think that could do a lot to turn things around in the South.
Yeah. Good. Let's go to the questions. Yes. And please identify yourself, if you would.
Hi, my name is Pam Jones from Roxbury, and I have a quick comment and a question. My comment is Harris made reference to Rosa Parks, and for me, you kind of left the impression that Rosa had acted as an individual who was tired of taking it, and I just wanted to clarify for people that Rosa was very much part of a movement, and that Rosa had been selected because of her commitment and because she was someone who didn't have any secrets in the closet and who would be a good person to take on this role of protesting the position of black people and not being able to ride the buses. My question is, I've been sitting in my seat both angry and kind of incredulous that you would have this panel talking about civil rights and voting rights, and that you would have 4 white males up here discussing it. Not that I doubt any of your commitments, and it's been very interesting and informative to me, but I'm quite disappointed because I brought my 2 children here to learn about their history, and they're not getting a chance to hear it. We're not going to be able to stay for the whole day, but this very important panel, y'all messed up here.
Jim, let me say that your children should be sure to stick with it till John Lewis comes, because he can make up for 4 white men anytime. I'm on circuit with him in amazing places, and we have him later this afternoon. And I get your point, but I'm hold fire in part till John has had his say. On Rosa Parks, let me urge everyone to read her little, beautiful, extraordinary autobiography. I reread it yesterday, My Story. And she goes to great lengths to say that the legend that she was picked to be a select case absolutely untrue. What you said is deeply true, that she had been active on her own and then recruited by E.D. Nixon, this great black Pullman leader and the longtime leader of the NAACP. She had helped form the Women's Political Council that called the boycott in the first place. She had helped organize it, of black women who were in the forefront of it. And she said it wasn't because she was tired as a person, but she had been thrown off the bus in 1943. But at that point, she didn't think about going to jail or resisting. She resisted until they threw her off the bus. It's quite a dramatic instance. She hadn't tested it since 1943 until 1955. And she tells how, since then, she had, out of this Highlander folk school, she particularly puts weight on Septima Clark, a black woman leader there that was part of this seminar, introducing her to the idea of nonviolent struggle beyond what they had been doing with the NAACP. But anyway, read her book because I found it tremendously moving, so strong and straightforward. And as you probably know, she will be lying in state in the rotunda of the Capitol all night tomorrow night. Tomorrow night into Monday morning.
So this gentleman here and then here, yes.
Thank you. I'm Reg McKean of Newton, and since my date for today and I have been stimulated by this event to have a disagreement over the validity of literacy restrictions on voting, I'd appreciate some help from the panel in understanding this issue. Of course, we know that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 forbid literacy restrictions if used as a means to deprive minorities of the vote, but it didn't ban literacy restrictions outright. I'm wondering if any members of the panel agree with me that there is still justification for such restrictions if not misused. I'm wondering if any states in the United States today still have literacy restrictions on voting. Anything else that the panel could say to help me understand this issue and win the debate with my date would be greatly appreciated.
Professor Kasar has the word here.
Literacy requirements, in fact, are banned in all states now. They have been since 1970.
By what?
By a Supreme Court decision, and in effect, the 1970 extension of the Voting Rights Act made permanent in all states because, and this is part of, literacy requirements were judged to be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And an interesting fact, something that we should all know, literacy requirements to vote were not exclusive to the South. New York State had an English language literacy requirement to vote until the mid-1960s, so that if you were Puerto Rican, you couldn't vote. But these are not permissible under the Constitution now anywhere.
Thank you. Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Philip Epstein. I'm a local student. A few of you made the comment that having majority-minority districts is better than nothing. But what do you say to the argument that you look at Congress now and you have almost equal representation in Congress as the proportion of black percentage population in the United States? So therefore, nothing more needs to be done for black people because they have proportional representation in their Congress. They can do anything that needs to be done. All the problems are solved.
Who would like to address that?
I think those are a lot of different questions going in. All we said was that single black districts are better than no black voting. To move toward a more representative system of elections that is sensitive to the will of the people, it seems to me we need to have a debate about how we form our districts, how we want to form them, how do we want to have competitive elections, and how we guarantee that people's votes count and matter. I would say, in the interest of candor, I think that we can say that there was kind of a bargain struck between the Republican Party and, to some degree, and black candidates to essentially bleach surrounding Republican districts and take a black district from 50% up to 95%, so that they would have a more secure seat. It remains for debate whether or not that's good for the overall democracy. I don't think it is. I remember in President Clinton's first Secretary of the Agriculture, Mike Espy, was the only person who was a member of Congress from Mississippi, was the only one after the redistricting that year who asked to have his district black representation reduced to 50-50 because he said it would make him a better congressman. We don't have very many people like Mike Espy, and it was a great tragedy that he was essentially hounded out of public life.
Yes.
My name is Tafara Wala Muhammad. I'm from the Highlander Center in New Market, Tennessee.
Welcome.
From Highlander, right?
My question is about the right to vote amendment in the Constitution. With the current role of the electoral college system in the election of the Vice President and President of the United States, how will the establishment of the right to vote amendment in the Constitution affect the way that these people are voted in? You understand?
I think that's
With the
me.
way that the electoral college system currently works.
No, it's a very good question, and here I have to begin by confessing that there are several versions of this amendment floating around, depending on whether we want to tackle head-on the Electoral College or not. There would be a way to phrase such an amendment saying that every citizen of the United States has a right to vote for all offices, including for electors to the Electoral College, which would have no impact. It would guarantee your right to vote, which, again, Bush v. Gore states flat out there is no right to vote in presidential elections until a state legislature grants it. So there's one way to phrase it that would overcome that problem but keep the Electoral College in place. There is another way to phrase it and another version of it that would simultaneously abolish the Electoral College. I personally favor the second version, but we're trying to bring along some people in Congress on that one.
Yes, over here.
Suzanne Rico, Boston. What's your response to those people who say, why do we need to renew the Civil Rights Act? Everything is free and fair. Just work hard. People are going to do the right thing. So why do we need to renew the
Yeah, the
Civil
playing
Rights Act?
field is level now, so why do you have to play with the rules?
Well, we have I don't know that much about the particulars of the legislation and of the renewal, but from a historical point of view, we have pretty clear lessons of backsliding on fundamental rights in Reconstruction, where not only were fundamental political rights withdrawn, but our whole history was inverted, where we convinced ourselves that, the Ku Klux Klan was the heart of romance. And a wonderful, our Hollywood films are today founded on a film that romanticized the Ku Klux Klan, that had a profound emotional reaction across the country, north and south, among white citizens. And we reinterpreted all of Reconstruction and said it was a great thing to take voting rights away from black people. And I think it could happen again. And the legislation in the Voting Rights Act, and I'm not sure of all of the particulars, to keep those guarantees in place, it seems to me would protect against some of the kind of mischief that you see coming in Georgia and in other states. That's really more your field, I'm sorry.
We only have 3 minutes left here, so I wonder if the two people at this microphone, if you can ask your questions one after the other, then we'll have the panel address them as a package.
Well, that's good. My name is Lyda Peters, and I'm a faculty member part-time here as well as in other colleges. And I teach the civil rights movement in one form or another. And by the way, I'm very glad, Mr. Branch, I've been waiting for your third piece of the trilogy. But here's the issue. Because so much literature focuses on individuals such as Dr. King and such as Mrs. Parks, and very important individuals. It gives those people who came after us an impression that nothing changes unless you have one leader. In fact, just to dovetail on what the woman in the beginning said, I think an important book is The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Ran It, because not only does it talk about Mrs. Parks, but it also gives people who are sitting here an idea that it wasn't a single person's standing up that really got this bus boycott going, but rather many, many people who had been planning beforehand. So my question is, what do you tell students when they say to you, well, Dr. King has died, Mrs. Parks is gone, and there are a lot of issues that I must deal with, but so how do I do that? Since it takes
Great.
one person.
That's a great question, and we'll add one other to it. Yes.
Hi, I'm Wendy Irvine. I'm a Unitarian from Cambridge, so I appreciate that nod to my history, too. I have a question which I think is related, there were two comments made, and one was about Martin Luther King and saying that he had the ability to appeal to public conscience by weaving together strands from both religious and patriotic doctrines or principles. And the other was that there's a lack of public discourse today. So my question is, what language should such public discourse take? Which doctrines and principles do you think can be harnessed today? And in what forum or by what means can we generate that public discourse, and in particular without such charismatic leaders today, or if there are, if you could point to those? Thank you.
Who would like to use the remaining minute and a half to answer this question? I nominate Taylor Branch.
Taylor was staring at his shoes.
To begin with the last part, how do you do this? That's really the question of how does the movement proceed? And every day in the movement was people were at one another's throats trying to figure out how to amplify these questions. So that's a process. There's no simple answer to it. I think it ties to the previous question in the sense that you don't wait for Barbara Walters to tell you what to do, and you don't wait for the charismatic leader. It never would have happened. Rosa Parks was a very ordinary person when this thing happened, in the sense of being a seamstress in Montgomery, and the movement was full of ordinary citizens. Jonathan Daniels, who was a seminarian here in Cambridge, when the call came to go to Selma, in the morning he opposed it because he was a strict theologian in seminary who said that he shouldn't go without the permission of the Bishop of Alabama. By afternoon, because his girlfriend decided otherwise, he changed his view and went and stayed and was assassinated in Alabama. And Paulie Murray, a lawyer, filed a lawsuit in the trial in that case that won women the right to sit on juries. We can scarcely imagine no woman in Alabama of any race could sit on any jury in the state of Alabama until a trial after the Jonathan Daniels assassination from somebody who wasn't even sure he should go in the morning. So individual citizens' choices matter all along the way in trying to help us keep our responsibilities, live up to our responsibilities as citizens.
There's more to say, but no more time to say it in. Please join me in thanking Taylor Branch, Harris Wofford, and Alex